Have you ever wondered why in medical, pharmaceutical, or drug testing research, they use mice instead of other animals like dogs, monkeys, rabbits, or even bigger animals like pigs? Well, it's not just because they're cute and tiny. There are some really good scientific and practical reasons behind it. So let's explore those reasons. First off, mice have some really favorable biological characteristics that make them great for research. They're pretty small, which means they take up less space in the lab. This is a big deal when you're working with a bunch of animals. And they reproduce fast. On average, mice have about 6 to 8 offspring per pregnancy, and their gestation period is only about 19 to 21 days. That's like 2 weeks, guys. This makes breeding mice super easy, and it's great for genetic studies or if you need a lot of animals for long-term experiments. Plus, mice don't live that long, usually a few months to a few years. So you can actually observe long-term effects of things like drugs or diseases without having to wait too long. For example, if you're studying the effects of a new drug for cancer treatment, you could see the results in a few months rather than years if you were studying a longer living animal. Also, mice are actually pretty similar to us biologically. About 85–90% of their genes are similar to ours. So studying them helps us understand how diseases and drugs affect humans better than using other animals. Now, this doesn't mean that mice are exact replicas of humans, but they're definitely a lot closer than you might think. Another reason why mice are so popular in labs is because they give researchers a lot of experimental control. When you're doing scientific experiments, it's really important to have as little variability as possible so that you can be sure the results are accurate and reliable. With mice, it's easier to get groups of animals that are genetically identical or very similar. This means that any differences you see between the groups you're comparing, like the ones that received a drug versus the ones that didn't, are more likely to be due to the drug itself, rather than just natural differences between the animals. It's kind of like how when you're baking a cake, you want to make sure all the ingredients are the same so that the cake turns out the same every time. Using genetically uniform mice helps researchers do just that. Additionally, mice are pretty easy to manipulate genetically. Scientists can use techniques like gene knockout or gene addition to create mice with specific traits or diseases. For example, they can create mice that lack a certain gene to study how that gene affects a particular disease. Or they can create mice that express a human gene to study how that gene works in a living organism. These genetically modified mice are incredibly useful for understanding the underlying mechanisms of diseases and testing potential treatments. Plus, mice have pretty standard physiological responses, especially in their immune, metabolic, and nervous systems. These systems often react to things like drugs or diseases in a similar way to humans, which makes them a great model for studying human health and disease. Beyond these biological advantages, there are also some practical and economic reasons why mice are so popular in labs. Compared to larger animals like rabbits, dogs, or monkeys, mice are relatively cheap to house and feed. They require less space and fewer resources, which means that more experiments can be done at once and overall costs are lower. Mice are also pretty easy to organize and manage. You can keep hundreds of them in cages, and it's pretty straightforward to keep track of who's related to whom and what they've been exposed to. This makes large-scale studies much more feasible. Finally, using mice is pretty standard in the scientific community. Researchers around the world use lab mice to test drugs and study diseases. So using a standard model makes it easier to compare results across different studies. This consistency makes the work of scientists more reliable and credible. Now let's talk about why other animals aren't used as much as mice. First off, some animals like dogs and monkeys are just too expensive to use in most experiments. They need special diets and lots of care, and they also reproduce slowly, which means that it takes a long time to get enough animals for a study. Plus, using these animals can be ethically challenging, as they're closer to humans in terms of intelligence and emotional complexity. Then there are smaller animals like insects. While they're easy to keep and reproduce quickly, they're just too different from us to be super useful for studying human health and disease. Their physiology and metabolism are very different from ours, so the results of an experiment on insects may not apply to humans. Sure, there are some similarities, but overall they're pretty different. So while insects are great for studying insect stuff, they're not the best model for human medicine. Some people argue that using animals in research is just plain wrong, but we're talking about it in the context of why mice specifically are used. But if you're interested in learning more about the ethics of animal testing, let me know in the comments, and maybe we can do a separate video about it. In summary, lab mice are the go-to animals for medical, pharmaceutical, and drug testing research because they hit a sweet spot between being biologically close enough to humans to provide useful insights and being easy to raise, cost-effective, and amenable to genetic manipulation. Their small size, fast reproduction, and short lifespan make them perfect for observing the effects of long-term studies in a relatively short period. Plus, their genetic similarity to humans and predictable physiological responses make them excellent models for studying human health and disease. Of course, mice aren't the only animals used in research. Other animals like rats, non-human primates, and rabbits still have their uses. But mice remain the most popular choice for good reason. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions or if there's anything else you'd like to learn about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.